Hello and welcome to the SportsPro podcast. Now, before we start the show, I just wanted to give you a little nudge to talk about our sister podcast. That is Streamtime Sports. It features my colleague Chris Stone and SportsPro CEO Nick Meacham, and it's published weekly, covering all of the latest news and developments in the sports media space, with special focus on the people, businesses and technologies driving the sports streaming revolution. It comes out every Wednesday and is the go-to place for broadcast professionals. Streamtime Sports wherever you get your podcasts. We are live. Hello, welcome to the latest edition of the SportsPro podcast. I am joined by my colleague Steve McCaskill. For a very important reason, Steve is our technology editor and we are at the SportsPro AI conference. Steve, where are we specifically at the SportsPro AI conference?
We are at the heart of West Ham United's London Stadium. We're sat out in the stands, taking it all in. It's a bit chilly, even for September, but it's a great place to be right now, I think.
For sure. I always quite like seeing the big SportsPro branding on the biggest, is it the biggest screen? I think it's one of the biggest screens in world football or football stadiums or in the world, something like that.
I think what we're going with, it's the biggest screen in Europe in the exterior of the stadium.
Love it. Well, SportsPro branding's all over it this week, and if you want to come check that out, you can't, because you'll be hearing this after it's finished. But what we're trying to do on this week's episode of the pod is bring you a little bit inside SportsPro AI. The first part of your day, Steve, was spent with some very interesting folk who are very much at the centre of what's going on with sports and AI. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this morning we had a invite-only, behind-closed-doors CTO forum.
Chief Technology Officers, for those people who don't speak tech. But yeah, carry on.
It's one of those things, it's assumed knowledge, I'm sorry. Chief Technology Officers, so the people leading the technological change within sports, and a lot of their in tray at the moment is, as you might expect, AI. They're having to find out how to implement intelligent technologies into their own operations. The benefits and advantages of this are widely acknowledged within sport, but it's not just a case of switching it on. You've got to think about how it can help, how you do it. It's not just about technology, but it's about culture and process. And we thought it was a really good opportunity to pick the brains of some of these leading figures, hear what they had to say, what they're working on. As you can imagine, some of the stuff that they are doing it's sensitive. You know, it's commercially sensitive in terms of, I guess, their own sectors of the sports industry, who they're working with. But we wanted to hear about some of the challenges and then also some of the exciting things that they're working on. And it was a really great morning, really good to hear from these leading lights in this space about what use cases they thought were the most mature, what needed some work, what they felt the industry could do for them. And the forum that we had, at some point we're going to be producing a report from this, and with something we believe can be really valuable to SportsPro readers.
Like you said, some of that stuff is sensitive. Some of that stuff is going to be in a report. What can you tell us right now? What was your thing that you can legally tell us without getting in too much trouble that the listeners will find, wow, that's quite eye-opening?
What can I say without getting in legal trouble or betraying the confidence of some people who very kindly gave up their time this morning? I think the biggest takeaway was something that doesn't surprise me, in that there is a lot of hype. There is perhaps a lot of enthusiasm from people who don't necessarily work in technology, or there's enthusiasm from people who do work in a very specific part of technology and see an opportunity for themselves. I think most of the industry is still trying to figure out how they're going to use AI. They're not too concerned about using AI for AI's sake. They're not bothered about it. They just see opportunities. They don't really mind how it's being used.
It's the latest tool, I guess, and it's a more fun one that people think is extremely exciting.
Exactly. They see AI as a natural extension of digital transformation, and any technology company, whether it's big or small, is going to be using AI as a matter of course, and therefore it's just something that's going to happen. But there's privacy considerations. There's, again, just finding out what the technology is and what it can be used for. I think another thing that was quite obvious is that content creation is seen as the most mature use case so far, particularly text rather than audio-visual content. There's a lot of enthusiasm for how it can allow sports organizations to cover more with less. They don't necessarily see it as replacing humans. They see it as helping humans. And that was one thing that was pretty adamant. That's one thing we've heard in public, but the people are saying this privately as well. And I think that's, a lot of the hysteria about AI has come. It's going to take all of our jobs. So yeah, I think it was nice to have some level level-headed insights into where AI is going, what the real topic of conversation should be. And yeah, it's something that, we're going to sit down and try and get some insight from that and try and compile everything together.
Yeah, well, we look forward to that report coming out. What you mentioned there about level-headed takeaways or level-headed approach to AI is actually quite reassuring for me. As you said, it so far seems that with AI that at least the things that people see, large language model stuff is very good for producing text-based analysis and data. One of the sessions that I really wanted to highlight actually out of the sort of first day, and we're talking on day one here, was a really fascinating presentation by Melissa Robertson from Dark Horses and Maggie Murphy, who is best known as the former CEO of Lewis Football Club. The session was titled, "Can AI Save Football Sexism Crisis?" which it wasn't really the question that it was trying to answer, but it was a really interesting presentation about a campaign which got quite a lot of hype when it was first announced a year or so ago, which was the Hope Sogni AI-generated FIFA presidency campaign. And they talked about how they really put together the AI, I want to say robot, I guess that is the right word, for this digital FIFA candidate. And this is something that I remember seeing the campaign and being like, wow, that's really cool. They've created this kind of this chatbot, which is kind of well orientated to become a better advocate for the women's game in football. It explained how that happened and the process behind it and what the thinking was. If you haven't seen that campaign before, I'm going to just drop in a little clip here of the session itself, so you can get a better idea of what it exactly is that I am talking about.
What is Hope? Hope is an AI woman created by Melissa's agency Dark Horses and Twice, an AI platform. And we were trying to look for a solution that if we couldn't get a single woman elected or higher up the governance structure, let's figure out a solution that could aggregate the voices of lots of women in football from around the world. And ultimately, it was only AI that could help us to do this, to do that aggregation because of the struggles that people were facing in those different contexts. So it's about paving the way for a new cohort of women to have their voices heard and to be empowered and entitled in a way to say what they really felt and make the game in all of its forms a little bit better. Now, I think the one thing to be really aware of is that Hope could not be created using traditional, normal AI scraping. And that's super, super important. Because if she was scraped using traditional data and traditional information that's out there, it would be in the voice of all the people that are most vocal in those spaces and not catching the voices of all the women around the world that are trying to have their voices heard. So over about 10 months, Hope's knowledge and our outlook was curated through thousands of hours of interviews, news articles, speeches, documents, all kinds of information from women who work in football around the world, created into a system, including people like Moya Dodd, who took part in the project, but also including the likes of incredible women, Kat Craig, who's a lawyer and represents women who have been raped in football, or even people like Khalida Popal, who's the incredible first ever captain of the Afghanistan national women's team, who was made a refugee because of football. Now, collectively, Hope has this really encyclopedic knowledge of football policy, processes, economics to take to the next level.
It was an interesting use case for AI because I think what we've heard about a lot here is how do I use this to accelerate my business? And this is really about how do I use AI to accelerate a cause or a campaign in an effective way. This Hope Sogni example was a pretty strong way of doing that. Steve, you've not just been in the CTO forum, you've been around the grounds. What else have you found on your travels through SportsPro AI so far?
Well, being in a football stadium, I felt it appropriate to go to a specific session on how AI is being used in football. And we heard from La Liga, which is notable and it's created its own position for AI, which I think is noteworthy in itself.
It's a bit of a first, isn't it?
I'm not sure if it's a first, but it's still quite novel to have someone whose specific remit is that.
Maybe a first within the elite tier of domestic football anyway.
As far as I'm aware, there's nothing like that. Even the Bundesliga, which has quite a strong tech focus, I'm not sure that there is this. The Liga also, to be fair, has quite a big tech focus with the Liga Tech, which, in its partnership with becomes Sportian. So it's definitely something that it sees as something really important that it should be doing, particularly because it's got, I guess, international expansion at its forefront, even more so than many other leagues. So, for example, it's using things like real-time AI translation for player interviews. So we're hearing from them. Mike Armstrong, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Juventus, was also there. And then we had WSC Sports, which, most people in the industry will know them as AI-powered highlight clipping, and they're very well known within the industry. So it was just interesting to hear from, I guess, people working in the sport and hearing how they actually were using it. And I've forgotten to mention Tim Jaeger from Eintracht Tech, who we've spoken to in the past. And they're just about experimenting, what they really hoped could be done within football. And I mentioned about level-headed behind the scenes. I think most people who hear about this event have actually been quite level-headed in general. I think it's been quite refreshing, as you said. So, Juventus see it as a chance. They see it across performance. They see it in terms of fan engagement, and they are just experimenting, trying to see what works, what doesn't, because they know that it's going to have some benefits. Again, it comes back to what I said earlier about they're not using AI for AI's sake. They're just trying to see how it can be used to create some value. So that's proof of concepts. If you're going to fail quickly. Tim Jaeger also gave some insight into the concept of Eintracht Tech and how the AI was going to be the next focus for them. And it was just, like I said, just really good to have some tangible use cases from some, to have a club as big as Juventus on stage talking about it, to have a big league like La Liga putting so much effort behind it. So lots of valuable insight there, some of which may find its way into the report that we're going to be doing. I'm going to plug that again, and we'll do when it comes out. I also managed to see your session with Populous.
Yes. Now, look, I don't claim to be any kind of expert into architecture. And actually, I don't think that was really the point of that discussion. It was more about how a business the size of Populous, which is got, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think the number is like 1,300 employees around the world designing most of the big famous sports venues you've heard of. They're involved in that in some way. So it was more about learning about how a company that size is implementing AI into its processes. And obviously there are some very specific things that apply to architecture, talking about using large language models, for example, to look at, you can train them to look at drawings and identify and answer certain things when it comes to very technical, often legal requirements. It can perform what are quite menial processes on that and really accelerate that process, which when you're a business that kind of size is actually very, very helpful. The main takeaway for me on that was actually it's less about this is going to transform architecture. And yes, an AI image generator can generate beautiful renderings, which we'll happily plaster all over our Instagram channel and be like, wow, look at this crazy new stadium that they're building in Saudi Arabia or Morocco or wherever it may be. But it was more about these are the things that actually you need to make this effective. And the other thing is to bring it back to that more sobering element is these are the things that it can't do. And this is where you still need humans to be a part of that process. Maybe actually be good if we just played that whole section of our discussion.
The technology landscape is rapidly evolving, right? We're seeing AI startups everywhere. Right. And everybody can get a .ai domain name if they want to, even though it doesn't mean they're using AI. But obviously, and you've probably heard this multiple times today, good data is the key. And so we've spent a lot of effort, as you see, building tools that generate and embed that data and then structure it properly for use for us. We're also working a lot about what data and knowledge we're actually handing over to people and what they're going to do with the data. There's not a lot of clarity in the construction industry around IP of data and things like that. The second to last one is that at the end of the day, these are just tools and they're supportive for us, and humans are still very much a part of the process in what we do. And then the last one is, at least for Populous, since they're just tools, we won't be judged on the tools that we use to deliver venues. We'll be judged on the quality of the venue. So that's ultimately where we're going to end up with all of this.
Nice. Steve, I'm very aware that you're a busy man when it comes to the world of technology and you've got a session to moderate quite soon. So let's check back in tomorrow and still see if we're feeling the same hopeful way about artificial intelligence. It's day 2 of SportsPro AI. Yeah, this morning actually, we were both sat next to each other holding hands in a really interesting session. I think interesting is a word that we use on this podcast quite a lot, but there's not actually that many times when things are maybe as interesting as they were in the particular session we were in. And that was because it was a joint session between PwC, obviously one of the sort of big 5 services companies, but perhaps the more interesting set of people on the session was Lisa Bacania from OpenAI. What Lee did on stage, I think it dazzled some people who maybe haven't used ChatGPT that much, but it also dazzled some people who had. There are some things that we were allowed to talk about in roundabout ways and some things that we're not allowed to talk about as part of that session. And that's the sort of exciting thing about coming to SportsPro AI, is that you've got to be here to see it all. But you were sort of left in a bit of a tech-gasm. Can you explain why that was?
That's got to be a first for the SportsPro podcast there. I think we can talk about it. I think we weren't allowed to take any visual memories of it because it's still
to make it sound exclusive, Steve.
It was exclusive, but it's still in preview. And I've been covering technology for 15 years, and there's only a handful of times I've been truly astounded. And what we saw today it was wow moment. And in terms of what ChatGPT can do, Lee showed us how you can take some dirty, unstructured data and transform it basically into a marketing campaign, complete with creatives. And it was pretty jaw-dropping stuff. And I think, you and I, we've both been experimenting with ChatGPT, see what it can do from a creative and sort of research point of view. But this is, I think it's fair to say it was another level.
Yeah, I mean, it was also good to watch a real expert use these tools. Like I fumble around with my prompts on ChatGPT, and I've got kind of good at getting certain things that I wanted to do. This was watching like a real master at work, and to sort of take the listener through what was a visual presentation. It was essentially, yes, as Steve said, taking a raw data set, taking some findings from that data set, using ChatGPT functionality, asking it to create a marketing campaign, and then using OpenAI Sora, the video platform, creating a marketing asset. It was very, very cool to watch.
I mean, PwC said that if they were to do it, it would take them 3 months to create what they created.
And it was created in half a day.
And that, I think when you were saying 3 months, I think that was just the creative element of it. I don't think that would have been through all the other
sign-offs and all of the other tedious bits that go into marketing campaigns.
Data analysis and and I think, again, it was a sport-specific example as well, which I think is really important because OpenAI and similar companies, they have an interest in sport. We've seen some Gen AI projects. We've seen like DeepMind get involved in tactical analysis and things. But here we saw something that was relevant to pretty much every single person in that room. And, I think a lot of people, that's going to be their takeaway from this event.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's going to be my takeaway from the event. Maybe not. We'll do takeaways at the end of the pod. But it was the thing I was looking forward to the most. I think people think of OpenAI almost as AI at this point because it's the thing that people know about and have read the most about, especially in sort of like in the industry sense. Like ChatGPT is almost a byword for AI these days.
Yeah, I think most people's interaction with this new wave of AI is ChatGPT. That's definitely in the public consciousness, even though there's lots of other companies working on AI technology, and we've seen some of them over the last 2 days or so. So I think, headline grabber, really interesting use case, and it really is exciting times for sport in terms of what can be done, especially on the content creation side. Yeah,
that was actually one of the other things in that presentation, and this was the sort of the PwC element of it, was they took us through a survey that they did. Basically, tech firms are the companies that are using AI the most, and then it was agencies. And when it came to agencies, and this wasn't just specific to agencies, but you imagine broadly, this is where that use case comes from. The thing that ChatGPT or OpenAI stuff at the moment is being most used for is still content and content creation.
Yeah, it seems to be the single most mature use case. I think that extends even beyond sport. That's multiple industries. And then we saw in that presentation the PwC element side of it in terms of other areas that are being boosted by AI just being on the scene. So things like spatial computing, which is things like Apple Vision Pro. That's content that's in many cases relies on data. So it's not just in terms of the creative elements of it, it's about enabling entirely new forms of content. That was quite apparent.
That actually was really interesting, wasn't it? I mean, IoT was another one that was mentioned. And these are all technologies that, as you said, they've been around for a little while. I think the first ever SportsPro Live I went to, saw an IoT presentation, and it was very impressive, but you sort of thought like, well, okay, but how do you make this like scalable? And that's really where AI comes into it, is that it suddenly unlocks a lot of things that previously seemed very, very difficult because of the amount of data, the amount of input that was required to do so. Now you can have a robot do it.
Yeah, I mean, if we go beyond content creation, think about the smart stadium concept. That relies heavily on IoT, and we've been told all these things that are going to be the future of stadium, the future of sport, going to your seat and having an entire new experience. It wasn't scalable. It was a couple of really sort of I say focused applications, so things like smart signage or CCTV or something like that. Now with AI, there's all sorts of things are possible. And I think, again, it's no surprise to see those technologies that aren't new receiving new lease of life because of this ability to manage and analyze huge amounts of data, automate it, and just make sense of it.
All right, we've covered OpenAI in that session. There was another one that you've been locked into on day 2 here. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Stats Perform, which I think most people will know better as Opta. So it was their chief scientist, it was Patrick Lucy, just discussing about what Stats Perform is doing with AI in terms of how it's helping its clients, which are everything from media companies to betting firms to teams themselves, and how they're building on their quite considerable legacy in data collection. Is that they manage 6.5 petabytes of data, which they say is 10 times more than anyone else. So that's a huge treasure trove to build on. Again, one of the things that's come out during this event is that the quality of data and the usefulness of this data is one of the biggest barriers to AI adoption. So if you have 6.5 petabytes, you're in a pretty good place. And it was displaying how, we saw some demos about how, so things like computer vision, which, is basically algorithms analyze broadcast footage to try and find out player positions or, I guess, movements. You can do all sorts of things, a lot of biomechanics, a lot of tactical analysis. But if you're using broadcast footage, you're not seeing the entire field unless you are using a specific angle, or it's crowd shot, so you lose track of what's happening. They're able to match up event data and then predict where a player is, but they're not on screen, based on when they exit and enter the next shot. And they can use AI to match this all together and create something that's going to be really useful. I also talked, I guess, things about essentially a personal assistant for the sports industry. A really interesting tidbit of information that most enterprise data isn't actually in large language models because it's not natural language. So lots of people don't talk about their work naturally. It's not normal language. And sport isn't natural language in many ways. So for example, expected goals is now part of everyday lexicon. It's taken a while to get to that point. The way people talk about sport is very different. There's even synonyms. So think about injury time. Is it stoppage time? Is it, added time, additional time?
There's a whole podcast devoted to this very field. One of my favourite podcasts devoted to this very field, which I recommend people listening to if they don't already, football cliches. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's not the normal way in which people talk.
Yes. These algorithms have to learn it. So they believe they've got the jump on everyone else on this. They can add real value, and by creating something dedicated to the sport. So maybe it wasn't anything new or revolutionary, but it was really interesting to hear about it spoken in such terms, or I guess what's something that seems so obvious that needed to be said. And yeah, it was a fascinating 20 minutes, half an hour.
Lovely stuff. Unfortunately, I wasn't in that session, so I didn't catch it. But this is why we have 2 people on the ground here, Steve, to make sure we're across everything. I feel like we've given a pretty good flavour over the last couple of days of what's been happening here. Obviously, you can't get the full idea of what it's like or of what's being spoken about in the conversations that are happening without being at the event itself. So this podcast is nothing if not like a small window into SportsPro AI. And if you want to find out a little bit more about these events, we have another one coming up in the US next year. I don't think this will be the first and last SportsPro AI event. I think I'm pretty safe in saying that, Nick. If you want to email me, that's fine. Steve, what are you taking away from the inaugural SportsPro AI?
Probably that it's difficult to say inaugural so many times in quick succession. That's how I'm taking away. But on a serious note, I think I've said this earlier, it was really nice to have some sensible conversations about AI, about its potential, what people are trying to use with it. There's lots of very intelligent, lots of very clever people here just looking for ways in how it can improve their organization. They're not using AI for AI's sake. They're people interested in technology that know that most technology is going to be AI infused in the future. I think they're looking to learn from each other, give some insights, some use cases. So it was just, I guess, refreshing. The other thing, I think, it's AI is already impacting content creation. Again, it's another thing that might have seemed obvious, but to hear from some of the people who are already using that in their operations to, I guess, automate tasks that they would otherwise take people away from other jobs. One thing about the sports industry, for its influence, a lot of places are still effectively small businesses. They're just very high profile ones. And I think they do, it is actually a really good example of where something like AI can help them do more with less. So yeah, those are my takeaways.
Interesting. So for me, I would say what I took away from this is AI is very useful, obviously, but it needs the right things to be in place in order to be effective. And whether or not that is the right data, whether or not that is the right approach to using it, the right strategy, the right person almost inputting it in order to find out what it is that you want it to get out, that stuff is all really important. And ultimately, at this stage, it is still just a tool. It's not something that is sentient. It is not something that is going to start thinking on its own. Although, I mean, one of the elements of the OpenAI session maybe sort of turns that on its head a little bit, but it still requires input and it still requires skill. And actually, that is a skill that the industry and anyone, not just the sports industry, but people who are using it will need to learn.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the other elements about AI, and that we will have to have very real conversations about ethics, about privacy, about societal impact of AI. And sport isn't going to be immune from that. But those are conversations that are going to have to happen elsewhere. It won't be sport in isolation. And so for now, I just think it's really important that sport is trying to stay ahead of this, trying to learn as much as it can.
All right. I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. Steve McCaskill, thank you very much for your AI insights.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
You're very welcome. All right. Speak to you next time, listener. Bye-bye.